Let's talk about something that puzzles most people when they first encounter it. If every nation is drowning in debt, who exactly is doing the lending? It's a fair question. When you hear that global debt has reached $251 trillion, more than 3 times the entire world's annual economic output, your first instinct is to ask, where did all this money come from? Who has $251 trillion just lying around to lend out? The answer is going to challenge some of your fundamental assumptions about how money works. Because the truth is, nobody has that money. Not really. And yet, the debt is very real. Let me start with a simple observation from the latest data. As of 2025, global debt sits above 235% of world GDP. The United States alone holds $36 trillion in debt, more than any nation in history. Japan follows with their debt to GDP ratio at 256%, which means they owe more than twice their entire annual economic output. And it's not just the wealthy nations. Developing countries now carry 31 trillion in public debt, growing twice as fast as in developed economies. So again, who's the lender? The short answer is we are, all of us, through a complex system that most of us don't fully understand. We're simultaneously borrowers and lenders, debtors and creditors. But let me unpack that properly, because the details matter enormously. Let's start with the United States, since it's the easiest to track. 3/4 of American debt, about $27 trillion, is held domestically, not by foreign governments, but by Americans themselves and their institutions. Here's how it breaks down. 42% is held by private investors. That's your pension funds, your mutual funds, your insurance companies. When you pay into your retirement account, that money doesn't just sit in a vault somewhere. Your pension fund manager invests it. And one of the safest investments available, government bonds, treasury securities. So when we say the United States owes $36 trillion, a huge chunk of that is owed to American workers' retirement savings. The debt finances current government spending while simultaneously serving as the bedrock of financial security for millions of people planning their retirement. Another 20% is intra-governmental debt. This is what one part of the government owes to another part. The Social Security Trust Fund, for instance, holds about $2.4 trillion in treasury securities. The government borrowed from Social Security to finance other operations and now technically owes that money back. It's accounting really one pocket of government lending to another pocket. And here's where it gets truly fascinating. 13% of US debt is held by the Federal Reserve, America's central bank. Now, you might ask, how can a government owe money to its own central bank? Isn't that like owing money to yourself? Yes and no. This brings us to the second layer of understanding. After the 2008 financial crisis, and again during the COVID-19 pandemic, central banks around the world engaged in something called quantitative easing. The Federal Reserve's holdings of US government debt went from about $1 trillion in 2010 to more than $6 trillion in 2022. How did they buy all these bonds? Did they have $5 trillion saved up somewhere? No, they created it electronically with keystrokes. Now, before you dismiss this as some kind of fraud or magic trick, understand that this is how modern monetary systems work. When a central bank buys government bonds, it credits the seller's account with new reserves. This isn't printing money in the traditional sense. No physical currency changes hands. It's expanding the monetary base through what's called open market operations. The central bank buys bonds, the sellers now have cash reserves, and theoretically, this should encourage lending and stimulate the economy. The money supply expands, interest rates go down because there's more money chasing the same amount of bonds, which drives up bond prices, and down yields. Here's the crucial bit. When quantitative easing happens, the government issues bonds, private institutions buy them, and then the central bank buys them from those institutions. It's a two-step dance that maintains the appearance of market operations while effectively allowing the government to finance itself through monetary expansion. The Bank of England did this. The European Central Bank did this. The Bank of Japan has been doing this for decades. In 2024, the ECB held massive quantities of government bonds purchased under various programs. By 2025, central banks globally had unwound some of these positions, but they remain enormous holders of government debt. So when people ask who's the lender, a significant answer is central banks using money they created specifically for that purpose. Now, let's talk about the international dimension, because this is where the story gets geopolitical. Foreign investors hold about $9 trillion of US debt. Japan holds 1.13 trillion, making it the largest foreign creditor. The United Kingdom holds 808 billion. China, despite all the headlines, holds 757 billion, down from over 1.3 trillion a decade ago. Why do foreign governments buy another country's debt? First, it's considered safe. US Treasury bonds are backed by the full faith and credit of the United States government, which has never defaulted. For Japan, holding US Treasuries provides stable, predictable returns on their massive foreign exchange reserves. Second, it serves strategic purposes. When China accumulated dollars through its trade surplus with America, it needed somewhere to park that money. Buying US debt kept demand for dollars high and helped China manage its exchange rate. A strong dollar relative to the yuan makes Chinese exports more competitive. Third, it creates interdependence. Japan's 1.13 trillion in US treasuries isn't just an investment, it's leverage. During recent trade tensions, Japanese officials explicitly mentioned these holdings could be a card on the table in negotiations. It's financial diplomacy. But here's the paradox within the paradox. These foreign creditors are themselves heavily indebted. Japan's government debt to GDP ratio is 256%. China's is rising rapidly, now at 88%. The UK's is substantial as well. So we have indebted nations lending to other indebted nations. It's not that Japan has extra money sitting around. Japan borrows from its own citizens and institutions, then uses some of those funds to buy American debt. Meanwhile, Japanese institutions might also own Japanese government bonds, American bonds, European bonds, a diversified portfolio of sovereign debt. The whole system is circular, interconnected, a vast web of mutual obligations. This brings us to perhaps the most important lender of all, ordinary people's savings. Across OECD countries, pension fund assets reached $63 trillion in 2024. That's not government money. That's workers' deferred compensation money set aside for retirement. In the United States alone, individual retirement accounts held $18 trillion by mid-2025. Where does that money go? A huge portion goes into government bonds, either directly or through mutual funds. Why? Because pension funds need safe, reliable returns. They can't gamble with retirees' money. Government bonds offer exactly that, predictable, relatively safe returns. So your pension fund buys government bonds. The government uses that money to finance everything from infrastructure to social programs to military spending. In return, you get a promise. When you retire, you receive monthly payments funded partially by the interest the government pays on those bonds. In essence, you are lending to your government through your retirement savings, and your government promises to pay you back with interest when you're older. But your government finances those interest payments partly through more borrowing. The system works as long as economic growth continues and confidence remains high. There's something almost beautiful about this arrangement, but also something precarious. Pension funds now hold such massive stakes in government debt that they've become systemically important. Several governments have started eyeing these funds as potential sources of domestic investment. Australia's treasurer recently urged the country's $4.3 trillion retirement system to invest more in domestic housing and infrastructure. Japan's ruling party asked their public pension fund to increase domestic private equity investments. This trend, what one researcher called pension fund nationalism, reveals the strain in the system. Governments are increasingly cash constrained, while pension funds have grown enormous. The temptation to redirect that capital toward national priorities grows stronger. We haven't even talked about commercial banks yet, and they're crucial to this story. Banks hold significant amounts of government debt. In the United States, depository institutions hold 12% of domestic government debt not held by the Federal Reserve. Insurance companies own 4%. These aren't passive holders. Government bonds are active parts of banks' capital management strategies. But here's where it gets really interesting. Banks don't just hold government debt. They help create the money that buys it. When you take out a loan from a bank, the bank doesn't transfer existing money from someone else's account to yours. It creates new money by crediting your account. This is called fractional reserve banking. And it's how the vast majority of money in modern economies comes into existence, not through central banks printing currency, but through commercial banks making loans. These loans become deposits. Those deposits can then be used to buy government bonds. So, in a very real sense, the money that finances government debt is created through the banking system's lending activities. The debt and the money supply grow together, intertwined. This is why the question, who's the lender, is so hard to answer. The money being lent is often created in the process of lending. It's not a zero-sum transfer from someone who has it to someone who needs it. It's expansion of the monetary system itself. Now, you might be thinking, if everyone's borrowing from everyone else, and central banks can create money to buy bonds, and banks create money through lending, doesn't this mean debt doesn't really matter? That's the seductive logic of modern monetary theory, which argues that governments with monetary sovereignty, those that borrow in their own currency, can never run out of money because they can always create more. But let me tell you why this thinking is dangerous and why the current debt situation genuinely worries me. First, there are real resource constraints. You can create money, but you can't create productive capacity. If government spending outpaces what the economy can actually produce, you get inflation. We saw this in 2021 and 2022. Years of monetary expansion and fiscal stimulus, combined with supply chain disruptions, led to inflation rates not seen in decades. Central banks had to raise interest rates aggressively to cool things down. And here's the problem. Higher interest rates make all that debt more expensive. The United States now spends more on interest payments than on its military budget. Interest payments reached levels where they exceed spending on education or other critical areas. For the US, this is uncomfortable. For developing nations, it's catastrophic. In 2023, developing countries paid $25 billion more to external creditors than they received in fresh loans, a negative net resource transfer. 61 developing countries now spend 10% or more of government revenues just on interest payments. That's money not going to healthcare, education, or infrastructure. The IMF's chief economist warned us at Davos 2025 that the situation is worse than you think. There's been what she called an optimism bias in forecasting. Every time economists project debt levels, the actual outcomes end up worse because nobody can predict the next crisis, and crises keep coming. The 2008 financial crash, the 2020 pandemic, and whatever comes next. Second, there's the problem of rolling over debt. In the next 3 years, 42% of total sovereign debt and 38% of all outstanding corporate bond debt will mature. This needs to be refinanced. If interest rates remain elevated, refinancing becomes much more expensive. Countries that borrowed at 2% during the low-rate era might have to refinance at 5% or 6%. That's a massive increase in debt servicing costs. Some countries won't be able to refinance at acceptable rates. They'll face a choice: default, restructure, or accept punishing terms from the IMF and other lenders. We've already seen this. 8 countries have undergone sovereign debt restructurings since 2020. Ghana, Sri Lanka, Zambia, among them. More will likely follow. Third, there's the crowding out effect. When governments borrow heavily, they compete with private businesses for capital. This drives up interest rates, making it more expensive for companies to invest in productive activities. Over time, this reduces economic growth, which makes the debt burden even harder to manage. Economists estimate that government borrowing crowds out about 33 cents of private investment per dollar borrowed. That's innovation not happening, businesses not expanding, productivity not growing. The long-term cost is invisible but real. What keeps me up at night is how interconnected everything has become. Your pension fund owns government bonds. Those same governments owe money to foreign central banks. Those foreign central banks are themselves propped up by their governments, which borrow from their citizens and institutions. Banks hold government bonds as safe assets while also holding private debt. Everything's linked. During the UK's pension fund crisis in 2022, when bond prices fell sharply, pension funds faced margin calls on derivatives they'd used to hedge interest rate risk. They had to sell bonds to raise cash, which drove prices down further, requiring more sales. It was a doom loop, stopped only by Bank of England intervention, more quantitative easing, more money creation, more debt. This interconnection means that problems in one part of the system can cascade rapidly. A government debt crisis can become a banking crisis, can become a pension crisis, can become a currency crisis. The 2008 financial crisis taught us this lesson, but we seem to have forgotten. The private credit market, direct lending by non-bank institutions, has exploded to $2 trillion globally. This shadow banking system is less regulated, less transparent, and deeply interconnected with traditional finance. When the next crisis hits, we'll discover links we didn't know existed. Let me give you some concrete examples of what happens when this debt system breaks down. Ghana in 2023, the government couldn't refinance its debt. Interest payments consumed most of government revenue. They restructured domestic debt, hitting banks, pension funds, and individual bondholders. Pensioners saw their retirement savings restructured longer maturities, lower interest rates. It was presented as necessary, but for individuals, it was devastating. The promised returns they'd counted on simply evaporated. Sri Lanka in 2022, economic mismanagement, lost tourism revenue from COVID, and a fertilizer ban that crashed agricultural output, created a perfect storm. The government couldn't pay its debts. Social unrest followed. The president fled the country. The IMF stepped in with loans attached to strict conditions, austerity measures that hurt ordinary citizens most. Debt to GDP ratio of 358%, the highest in the world. The financial system essentially collapsed. Banks froze deposits. People couldn't access their own savings. Inflation skyrocketed. A middle-class society descended into poverty within months. These aren't just statistics. These are cautionary tales about what happens when debt becomes unsustainable and confidence evaporates. So let's return to our original question with a full picture now visible. Who's the lender when every nation is in debt? The answer is we are collectively the lenders through a system that creates money as it creates debt. Governments borrow from their citizens through bonds bought by pension funds, insurance companies, and banks. They borrow from foreign governments and investors. They borrow from their own central banks, which create money to buy bonds. The private banking system creates money through lending, which generates deposits that can buy more government bonds. Money isn't a fixed resource that gets redistributed. In modern economies, money is created through debt. When a loan is made, new money enters the system. When debt is repaid, money disappears. The total amount of money in existence is roughly equal to the total amount of debt plus central bank reserves. So, who's the lender and where does the money come from? I have the same answer. The money is created through the process of lending itself. The system is self-referential, circular. Debt creates money and money perpetuates debt. This works brilliantly until it doesn't. Even if you don't own government bonds directly, this affects you profoundly. Your pension depends on it. Your bank stability depends on it. Your government's ability to provide services depends on it. The interest rate on your mortgage depends on it. Employment levels depend on it. When this system works smoothly, prosperity is possible. When it stutters, everything becomes harder. The key variable is confidence. As long as people believe governments will repay their debts, the system functions. Money flows. Bonds are bought and sold. Interest rates stay reasonable. But confidence is fragile. It's built on expectations, which are built on past performance and future projections. Right now, several worrying trends converge. Debt levels are at historic highs. Interest rates, while down from recent peaks, remain elevated compared to the 2010 seconds. Economic growth is slowing in major economies. Geopolitical tensions are rising. Trade wars, actual wars. Climate-related disruptions. Demographic shifts mean aging populations in developed nations need their pension payments while workforces shrink. The IMF projects that by 2035, global public debt could be 10 percentage points higher than current forecasts due to unexpected shocks. We've averaged one major crisis per decade recently. There's no reason to think that pattern will change. I'm not here to spread panic. Systems this complex have remarkable resilience, but they also require active management and honest reckoning. For developed nations, the path forward requires fiscal discipline without austerity. This sounds contradictory, but isn't. It means investing in productivity-enhancing activities, infrastructure, education, research, while being extremely rigorous about eliminating wasteful spending. It means tax systems that actually collect revenue from those best able to pay. It means resisting the political temptation to fund everything through borrowing. For developing nations, the challenge is even harder. They need debt relief restructuring that acknowledges some debts simply cannot be repaid. The international community needs a better sovereign debt restructuring mechanism. The current system is ad hoc, slow, and often inequitable. Creditors fight over scraps while countries suffer. Central banks need to be honest about the long-term implications of quantitative easing. It was necessary during emergencies, but it's created distortions, asset price inflation, inequality, addiction to cheap money. Unwinding these positions will be painful. The Bank of England's quantitative tightening has already cost the UK government tens of billions as bonds purchased at low yields are now financed at higher rates. We need more transparency about pension fund management and the pressure governments face to redirect retirement savings toward domestic priorities. This trend toward pension fund nationalism could end badly if political priorities override prudent investment strategies. Most importantly, we need to rebuild fiscal space. When the next crisis comes, and it will come, governments need the capacity to respond. Right now, many don't have that capacity. They're already stretched thin. When you're at 100% or 200% debt to GDP, there's no room for emergency spending without triggering a debt crisis. There's something profound here about how we organize modern societies. We've built a system where the future constantly finances the present. Governments spend today and promise to pay tomorrow. Workers Save today for consumption tomorrow. The entire edifice rests on faith that tomorrow will be prosperous enough to honor today's promises. This is historically unusual. For most of human history, you couldn't borrow against the future this way. Money was commodity-based, gold, silver, physical stuff. You couldn't create it with keystrokes. Credit existed, certainly, but nothing like the massive edifice we've built. The fiat money system, where currency has value because the government says it does, and we believe them, enables this future financing arrangement. It's allowed unprecedented prosperity. The past 80 years have seen poverty decline globally at rates previously unimaginable. Living standards have risen, lifespans have extended, but the bill is coming due. We've borrowed from the future for decades. At some point, we need to pay it back, not necessarily by repaying every dollar, but by ensuring that economic growth exceeds debt growth, so the burden shrinks relative to our capacity to bear it. That requires productivity growth, innovation, efficiency, education, investment in things that genuinely make us more productive. Not financial engineering, not accounting tricks, not just shuffling debt from one pocket to another. So when someone asks you, every nation is in debt, who's the lender? You can now explain the full, complex, circular answer. The lenders are pension funds, investing your retirement savings, insurance companies managing risk, banks holding safe assets, foreign governments managing their reserves, central banks creating money to stabilize their economies. And ultimately, all of us, through the savings we hold and the money we use, the debt is real. The money is real, even if it was created through lending. And the consequences of mismanaging this system are very real, as the people of Lebanon, Sri Lanka, Ghana, and many other places can attest. We've built a remarkable system. It's enabled prosperity and growth, but it's also fragile, dependent on confidence and good management. Right now, we're testing its limits. Debt at 235% of global GDP, central banks holding trillions in bonds, pension funds stretched thin, interest rates rising, growth slowing. The question isn't whether this system will face a crisis. The question is whether we'll manage the inevitable adjustments wisely or stumble into catastrophe. History suggests humans are very good at muddling through crises when forced to. We're less good at preventing them through discipline and foresight. I hope this time will be different. I hope policymakers will choose the hard path of fiscal responsibility, structural reform, and investment in genuine productivity, rather than the easy path of more borrowing, more money printing, and hoping for the best. Because make no mistake, we're all invested in this system. Your retirement, your children's opportunities, your country's ability to provide basic services all depend on managing this debt burden wisely. That's the real answer to the question. We are all the lenders, and we're all the borrowers. And our collective future depends on maintaining the delicate balance that makes this circular system work.